Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche Independent Candidate for U.S. Senate. It's Friday, August 23rd, and we will be talking about our astronauts who are stranded on the International Space Station, even though some people are very touchy about using that word. They were supposed to be there for 8 days, and they've been there for over 70 days at this point. Before I get to that, there's been some major developments. I want to report on the press conference of Robert Kennedy Jr., who is suspending his campaign. I think he'll remain on the ballot in some states, but in others, he is withdrawing his name so as to make sure that he is not a spoiler throwing the election to Kamala Harris. And what part of what this is born out of is not merely the censorship and totalitarian nature of what is wrongly called the Democratic Party, and the whole peculiar electoral process in the United States. And I'll tell you, as a candidate, I would love to have international observers come in and monitor the US elections. I think they would be horrified. I know people who came in from South America and saw that you could just go to the mailbox and drop in your ballot with no ID and no nothing, found that rather shocking. There's no control over who votes, and then there's no transparency or way of knowing if the result is accurate. But that's another story. But it is a factor in Kennedy's decision to suspend his campaign and basically endorse Donald Trump. Now, why? And he courageously took some time in his speech to go through the situation vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. And let me just underscore that we are closer now to thermonuclear war than we have been at any time, except when we actually dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was not because of a threat to us, but an insane decision, a cruel decision hatched by British and American intelligence circles who wanted to use the nuclear bomb as an instrument of terror. Japan was already negotiating the terms of surrender between the emperor and the Vatican and various channels into the US State Department. So this was not necessary, but it was done. Now you have a situation where, in effect, NATO has invaded Russia. It is well known, the Russians have said that they know that this quote unquote Ukrainian invasion of Russia, which was done in part for a photo op in order to say, you see, Ukraine is not finished, they're winning the war, just keep sending weapons. While the other part of the war, which is not being covered in the American press, in the Donbass, the Russians are advancing steadily 6 kilometers a day, 10 kilometers a day. Russia will win this war, but also this invasion of Russia was designed to attempt to seize a pair of nuclear power reactors near Kursk. These are not modern, these are old plants built in the model of Chernobyl, obviously an extremely dangerous proposition. And the West definitely doesn't want to admit that we are encouraging Ukraine to seize nuclear power plants. So we're not going to say that. But as far as the Russians are concerned, NATO has now invaded Russia. And there was an interview from a few days ago by the American former serviceman, Pat Lancaster, with a Russian, I believe, Chechen general in Kursk, who simply said, look, we don't feel like playing this game anymore, especially if the US is telling Ukraine it's fine to use long-range missiles to hit targets deep inside Russia. The long-range missiles come from the United States, or the Taurus missiles from Germany. And anyone who has some kind of amnesia about what happened in World War II can only imagine how it looks to Russia to have Germany and German colonels talking about needing 800,000 troops on the border of Russia to secure for European security. This is something that people really should take into account. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II, and they vowed never again. And unlike some people in the West, they actually meant it. Uh, so what this general said is that at a certain point, Russia will decide that the only option is they have to simply neutralize Ukraine. There is no more negotiating. Putin, in effect, gave them their last chance on June 14th. Either they can consider the terms that he put on the table, or Russia is going to have to finish the job. And he said at that point, the West is likely to use tactical nuclear weapons, and then everything is over. And he said, if Americans are worried about this, then you better get out in the streets. So I would take this very, very seriously. Now, what does that have to do with what Kennedy just did? Well, in his speech this afternoon, which I thought was very courageous, he went back to his decision to run. And he said, I wanted to run as a Democrat. My father was a Democrat. My uncle was a Democrat. But then what I discovered is this Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party that my family knew. And they began all kinds of dirty tricks to ensure that I could not be heard. And I don't recall if he went through this today, but as people may know, he he was told by the Democratic National Committee that if he won the Democratic primary in New Hampshire or the Iowa caucuses, that the DNC would give all of his delegates to Joe Biden. So what is the point of anyone even voting? And we see right now the Democratic Party has a nominee for whom no one voted. No one voted for her. No one voted for Kamala Harris. The donors decided who would be the candidate. Then they had a convention, which was not an open convention. It was already decided. They tried to appease the Democrats who oppose genocide in Gaza, of whom in many cases, 10 to 20% of their base. They had a little conference in a side room, but when it came to allowing them to address the convention, that was refused at the last minute. And as Kennedy said, he therefore made the decision to run as an independent. And people told him, well, that's going to be impossible. You'll never get on the ballot. I certainly know the difficulty of getting on the ballot in New York. And he said, we did. We created the most incredible independent movement the nation has seen. We had 100,000 volunteers. We gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. And then every time I got on the ballot, the Democratic Party filed a lawsuit against me. So we were then having to fight in all these lawsuits. My YouTube account was censored. I'm being censored on Google. I can't get my message out. He said, if I felt this would be a free and fair election, I would stay in. But what's clear to me is this is an exercise in futility. It is rigged. There is no debate. There is no openness. And not only that, he also then went in to discuss the situation with Ukraine and Russia and gave a very clear briefing on the history of what happened with the United States under Obama overthrowing the Ukrainian government in 2014, putting in a dictatorial regime that outlawed the speaking of Russian, the NATO expansion, that the West refused to listen to Putin. And then he said his stupid, maybe he gets it from Amaryllis Fox, that this drove Putin into the arms of Iran and China. But regardless, he's very clear that the danger of a war, a wider war, a war which the West is saying it has to win, which it can't win, is existential. And he said, Donald Trump is willing to speak with Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump said he would end this war in 24 hours. That alone is reason for me to endorse him. And then he described various conversations and meetings with Trump, especially on the matter of children's health, chronic diseases, the fact that in the United States we had and I'm quoting his figures, I have not checked to see if these are true, but I find it credible, frankly, that we had the highest COVID death rate because of the people who died of COVID, they had 3.8 comorbidities. That is, people were obese, people had diabetes, people had asthma, they had all kinds of other illnesses. And he said in the United States, we spend more money per capita on healthcare and we have less care. People are doing worse even than in European countries. And he said, this is a passion of mine. He said, I've seen, and people who know my symposium, I had a guest on who who was the one libertarian who ever got elected to the New York City School Board. And she was describing the public school lunches. And she showed pictures of American school lunches compared to what they're giving children in Japan and this country. In the other countries, they're beautiful. They have bright colored fruits and vegetables and fresh food. The American school lunches largely are beige. It's fried food, a piece of bread, a piece of highly processed something or other. It's not healthy. It makes it hard for the children to concentrate, and enormous amounts of refined sugar. So what Kennedy said are these two burning issues that Trump and he agree on: the danger of the war between Ukraine and Russia, the future of the children, censorship, and ending the forever wars. And he said, therefore, while we have some major screaming disagreements, I am not going to be a spoiler in this race and throw it to Kamala Harris, who will plunge us straight into nuclear war and who is continuing, as we see with the Democratic Party, this incredible censorship where there can be no other voices except the voices anointed by the billionaire sponsorships. And that's where it stands. And he said, people in my family, my wife, are going to have a very hard time with this. I'm sure that's true. I didn't hear any dishes breaking in the background. I don't know if that was going on, but I thought this was courageous and reality-based, because the truth of the matter is there are people in Washington who think we can win a nuclear war, and they say that Putin is bluffing. There is no evidence that Putin is bluffing, but we are pushing ahead to a point where the United States would have reacted long ago. My friend Scott Ritter said the number one issue in his mind of this election is who is going to stand up against nuclear war. Because if that's where we go, it doesn't matter where you stand on anything else. There will be no one left to discuss it. The first requisite of addressing our disagreements and so many other problems is to be alive. Now, obviously, as people know from me, I am not satisfied with the stance of Kennedy and Trump on Israel, Palestine, the Zionist lobby, etc. And therefore, I am not endorsing any candidate. I am merely saying that I do concur that if the Democrats win this election, I'm not sure we will survive, but frankly, I'm not sure that on the current trajectory where we're going to even make it to November. I think it's extremely dangerous. So with that cheerful introduction, what I would like to do is introduce first Bill Jones, who is an editor with Executive Intelligence Review. And you see also we have now Shahram Hassan, who is an author and engineer and who has been with us before. Bill writes for Executive Intelligence Review, and his late wife, Marcia Freeman, wrote, well, the How We Got to the Moon, but much, much more. Bill himself is somewhat of an expert on Vernadsky, and has been a longtime collaborator of LaRouche. And I will share when we get to Mr. Hassan some of the books that he has written. But Bill, why don't you go ahead, tell us why are we talking about these astronauts, and why is it a controversy to say that they're stranded?
Well, obviously, people were very much surprised by the fact that these guys went up on a commercial liner to the space station and were supposed to be there a little over a week and are now there 2 months and may be there even longer. They went on a Starliner flight. This is a new vehicle that was being developed by Boeing. Boeing is generally considered one of our top aeronautics and astronautics firms. They're having a lot of problems these days because of the general condition of U.S. industry that I think my colleague here will be talking a little more about. And therefore, they had problems even on this flight going up. There were some helium leaks. There were some thrusters that guided the ship one way or the other, and but they made it to the International Space Station. This was the maiden flight of the Starliner because the Starliner has got to prove itself as one of the commercial vehicles, which would be under consideration for general travel to and from the space station. I think that's at this point really questionable. The issue is, how are these people going to get back? Now, what Boeing has been saying is that we can resolve these problems through our remote activity. They can't do any spacewalks up there to do anything with it, and that therefore the astronauts should get on and come back. NASA, however, which is less concerned with shareholder value, which is probably number one in Boeing's book, is more concerned with saving the lives of the astronauts. So they have put their foot down and said they're not going back with Starliner, at least at this point. There is another option, and that is that you have SpaceX, another one of the so-called commercial vehicles going to the space station. They've had problems too. In August, they were supposed to send a SpaceX up to the station. They had problems with it. Therefore, the scheduled plan that they had of coming up in August has been delayed until September. So the SpaceX would come up there in September, and but it wouldn't leave until 6 months later. So I don't know if the astronauts took enough change of clothes with them while they were up there, but it looks like it's going to be 6 months unless there is another option. Now, if we look at this thing, why is this happening? Look, the space program from the Kennedy era has been really the model of US technology. It was one of the most important events in the last century, was our ability to get a man to the moon and bring him back alive. That Kennedy promised to do when he initiated this program. But at this point, it's in a mess and a lot of problems. And the biggest problem is the fact that there was a decision made that the role of NASA would be limited to kind of a coordinator, but that the hardware and the production would largely be sent out to private firms who would compete in deciding, what is going to be used by NASA and what is not going to be used. There are a lot of problems with this. The primary problem is, as I indicated, is that each of these firms is pretty much restricted by their shareholder value. That is, the considerations they're taking, as obviously Boeing was also thinking about in terms of bringing these astronauts back on a ship, which is not really 100% safe, also was a consideration to the potential losses that they would have as a result of this. This is because it is a commercial firm. Secondly, it's the issue of interoperability has also been lost. When NASA was in charge, all of the vehicles in the space station or going to the moon were of the same kind, that it gave the possibility of using one when one was not working. Everything would work fine because of this coordinated effort. But now you have the commercial companies; each of them is doing things on their own. One of the problems of the astronauts coming back with SpaceX is that the SpaceX has developed a new and exotic spacesuit, I think based on the Star Trek model, and it connects to the I'm sorry, Starliner had developed this new one, which the astronauts are now wearing, and it connects well to the Starliner, but it doesn't really connect to the SpaceX. So it's a question of whether they would really be safe in coming back on that without some change of the suit. Maybe that problem can be resolved, but that's also a part of this commercialization. The major problem, in one sense, to the extent that the space program had its biggest rationale as a science driver program, that is, the technology that was developed during Apollo is now all over the world in terms of Teflon, in terms of electronics, in terms of the telephones you're using. That was possible because it was a common good. It was developed by an entity of the U.S. government, therefore could be spread to everybody. Private firms don't have that. What they produce, what they are able to develop is of a proprietary nature, and they decide whether or not this will be shared with others. So you have a lot of problems here. This all happened under Obama. We had a program, NASA had a program already in the early 2000s during the George W. Bush period of developing the Constellation space vehicle. This was going to be a tremendous step up from the old Saturn, not as big as the Saturn, but much more technology oriented and capable of doing things the Saturn could not do. The object was that when you had the Constellation, you could go back to the moon by 2020. That was the program. And it could also take you to Mars. This was cut by Obama, who decided that he would give the franchise to Elon Musk's SpaceX, and therefore it was canceled. And you've had the private companies now are really running the show. This is the basic problem with our space program, and we're not going to make much headway unless we can start to deal with this again. There is also a third option of getting these people back, and it's an option which is probably known to most people. You could get on the phone, Bill Nelson or somebody could get on the phone with the head of Russia's Roscosmos and give a call to Mr. Borisov and say, Yuri, can you send up a Soyuz and get our people back in the next couple of days? And I am absolutely certain, in spite of the fact of the difficulties we have with Russia, we still have this cooperation. The Soyuz is still bringing astronauts to and from the space station, and we'll be doing that for the next 2 years. There's already a schedule. But this is a commercial operation now, and these are commercial astronauts, not NASA astronauts. But the biggest problem is that nobody wants to call them because that would break with this narrative, which is being foisted by the government and followed up to a T by the mass media, that Russia is our rival, led by this evil imperial wizard, Vladimir Putin. And therefore, going and asking him to do this would really break the back on that thing, unless people had the courage of doing that. But that obviously is an option which would allow them to come back much more quickly. Now, this brings us to the second problem with the space program, and that's the fact that space has always been envisioned, really from the first space launch, as in the common interest of all mankind. After World War II, when we had developed the atomic bomb, there was a general understanding that if we proceed in acting the way we have up until this point, and we end up in a new conflict, this could mean the end of all humanity. And therefore, there was a conscious attempt after World War II, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to create a world in which countries could begin to collaborate and talk and negotiate and in order to avoid new conflicts. That is the origin of the United Nations and the whole operation that Roosevelt intended to set up. This was at about the same time that people were aware that mankind would be leaving this earth and would probably be going to other planets, the closest of which, of course, is the moon, which is kind of like our neighbor and probably was once a part of us as well. And therefore, from the get-go, from the time that the first rockets were developed, there was a consideration that when we go to some place like the moon, we cannot treat it as we would have treated, countries that were colonized during the last century. It has to become a habitat for all of mankind, and getting there must be a common aim of mankind. And when President Kennedy launched his program of sending a man to the moon, from day one, his main concern was not only that the U.S. could develop this capability, but that they would do this in cooperation with the Soviet Union. He said it he intimated that in his initial inaugural address, and a month later he was very specific in his State of the Union message. Everybody knows about his speech in 1963, where he did present the proposal of the United Nations. But what they don't know is that all through those 3 years, there was a continual effort by Kennedy to bring the Soviet Union on board. In fact, there were negotiations ongoing in order to figure out how they could be brought on board. And the last thing that he wrote in 7 days before he was killed was a message to James Webb, who was the administrator of NASA, telling Webb that you must take charge yourself and see to it that we can bring the Soviet Union into our space program, including developing together on a lunar landing. And that, of course, is generally not known by people, but that was generally considered in the space community ever since that period, that we must work together on this issue, and that is being forgotten. I think back to the reason it is, two things happen here. One is Frank Wolf passed an amendment, first of all, making sure that we couldn't cooperate with China in space. China, of course, becoming one of the major space powers. The other thing was the unfortunate move by President Trump to institute the so-called Space Force as kind of the center of space activity, which puts it directly into this notion of rivalry with other countries, that we must have a police force of sorts up there. Obviously, military space always exists, but NASA was created by President Eisenhower specifically as a civilian operation, taking it away from the Army and taking it away from the Air Force, because he wanted this as a mode of cooperation with other countries, including with the Soviet Union. So now we're at a situation where people probably can rethink this whole affair. But the big thing is we got to get these astronauts back, and the easiest way, of course, is to have somebody call Borisov and get a Soyuz. Now, who would do that? Bill Nelson, of course, is the NASA administrator, but given the general atmosphere, political atmosphere in Washington, he probably is not the person that can actually, that has the capital or has the authority to do that. That would then go to Kamala Harris, who, as vice president, is the head of the national the National Space Authority of the United States. This has been the case since Kennedy was officially supposed to take that role, didn't want to be in charge of it, gave it to Lyndon Johnson. Ever since then, that role has been played by the vice president. So she's the point person, and she's got to give that call. But while these guys are kind of wandering there, wondering when they're going to get home to their families, she's at this disco event up in Chicago, having the time of her life here, without any consideration of one of the major tasks that she has been given in her role as vice president. And there should be a reaction to this. there has been a reaction in Russia. And I want to play a little video here, a short minute or two video of pensioners who have a program which is called the Putin Squad. Now, these are pensioners who put stuff on the YouTube, appealing to President Putin on a variety of issues. This is, a form of the democracy as it is in Russia, right? To make their opinions heard. And they picked up on this immediately, this fact of these astronauts stranded in space. And so they made an appeal to President Putin that I'll show you right here if we can get the video.
Владимир Владимирович, к вам обращаются отряды Путина из Краснодара. Сейчас на орбите находятся два американских астронавта. Они находятся в бедственном положении уже 2 месяца. Ихний Боинг, которым они взлетели, по дороге поломался весь. Двигатели отказали, и кое-как причалили они к Международной космической станции. И вот теперь они не знают, как вернуться. У нас к вам большая просьба оказать им помощь. Нужно отнестись к астронавтам по-людски. Кроме нашей страны никто не может поехать и спасти их, вернуть. Так что помогите им, пожалуйста. Мы вас очень просим. Спасибо.
So they're appealing to President Putin to go and send it up. Now, the question is, can we get our pensioners out on the streets calling on this to happen, right? And putting the demand on Kamala Harris that she should get on the phone and get these guys back. I doubt whether she has the courage to do that, but I think a demonstration of that sort, I think, would be worth 1,000 words.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we go to Nash, Dave, if you could show the picture. We did have a couple of people out on the street in Houston demanding that Kamala Harris do something about this. This first picture, stranded by Boeing stockholders. And do you have the, yes. So there they are. Yes, they're 58. Sunita Williams is 58 years old, and Barry or Butch Wilmore is 60. And I think today they were in an area where a lot of people know Butch Wilmore. They were saying they went to school with him as children and so on. So now what I would like to do is go to Nash Hassan, and perhaps Dave, you can put on the screen 2 of his books. The I don't know which one you're going to put first, but he is A Pursuit of Happiness, which I have not finished reading, but began, and it's very striking because he talks about 9/11, which is a very big deal for many, many New Yorkers in particular. And then the other book, oops, there we go. Durability and Sustainability of Concrete. And also you can go back to the Abasco slide. I think I'll let Nash say something about this, but notice their slogan, an Abasco project is a safe project. So with that, I will turn it over to Nash Hassan, and please tell us your thoughts on what's happening, what's wrong with Boeing, what's happening with our companies here.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah. I guess I'm a civil engineer, and I guess I have some knowledge of, as a passenger, I sit in a plane and I feel comfortable and I'm sitting in my first ride on a Boeing plane was 1963 when I came to United States on a Boeing 707. And I thought that was a luxury those days. And I never thought of any issue with the security or safety. But now, coming back to 2024, with all these accidents happening, and the rear door collapsing and of a plane is really, you feel have second thoughts of flying on an airplane. Let me go back based on my education and experience. I worked on the nuclear industry for 20 years, from the 70s to the 90s. And I can tell you the format of engineering, design, and quality control during construction, and the emphasis was given on the paperwork, paper trail. When you design something, it has to be verified and checked, and the independent organization does the quality control both in the design office and the field office. And I remember when we were building these plants in the field, I was a designer. So my chief engineer would say, Nash, you have to go out and check whether the construction people are doing the right job. This was like an independent check over and above the quality control and the construction staff. So just to report to him what was going on in the field. So now I think back that this was a very wise decision to have an independent verification of our design and implementation in the field. And that is the story of the success of our projects, where from Louisiana to St. Lucie to Sharon Harris project in Raleigh, so that they are still operational 50 years since they were went into service. So based on that, I've read a little bit of the design about the company Boeing, and I mean, it was a great company in 1958 when it started in Seattle, and it was a very successul, safe record. And what happened? The culture changed in the 1990s. Really, the big change in the cultural aspects, and there were more emphasis given on investor-owned, criteria, and not the employees were secondary. And the leadership also, there were changes in the leadership, and in 1997 there was a big merger with McDonnell Douglas. So then the cost-cutting mentality set in, investor demand, investor-dominated management came in the picture. So normally, if you have an engineering company, the head of the company should be an engineer. So like a Boeing company, if it's run by an outsider who's an investor, so he doesn't have the capability to see the issues and sort of point out. So that was a big change in the 1990s. And then what happened the headquarters changed in 2001. They suddenly decided, the big operations from Seattle to Chicago. And, all the production facilities were in Seattle. So Chicago was just the head office. So the head office got separated, the management team got separated from the real operations which are going on. And I guess one thing happened when they were developing this 737 program, which was very successful, and there was a demand, I guess, the competition. So there was a design change on the 737 MAX jets, which was similar in design. Normally, each design process had to be recertified. Both the pilot and the co-pilot has to recertify the operation of the plane. And but when this program was developed, modifications to 737 MAX jets, and the significant changes in design, they moved the engines forward, from the original design, and so they wanted more uplift and more maybe saving and more powerful engines. And during this process, there's no recertification of the design was done. So Boeing gave the impression that this is similar to the previous designs, and the pilots were not trained, and they put in new software which would really control the operation of the planes. And we call it MCS operation, maneuvering characteristic augmentation system. So computers took over. So if there was any glitch in the computer, the pilot would not know how to address it in the real field. As a result, after this plane was put in service, there was a big crash in 2018. And in Indonesia, 346 passengers died, followed by another crash in 2019 in Ethiopia. So there were no questions were raised. They did not say that this is a problem with the design and recertification. And finally, the FAA came in the picture and, of course, started investigating. And the few issues they have identified are like this. There were the quality control production issues during production, loss of experienced employees, layoffs and buyouts, less experience of workers and institution knowledge, and changes in the leadership. The present leadership, Dave Calhoun has been there since 2020. He's retiring this year. So there's a rapid change in the management. And also there was a big disconnect between the management and the employees, and also compliance with the procedures. So these are just basic issues, which are normally one would think that a company like Boeing, which is supposed to be safe, human lives are involved, and they should have a very high order of verification process, did not follow these procedures. For example, this 2000 recent accident was a 2024 accident with when the rear door plug, failure took place, and NTSB report showed that 4 bolts were missing from the door when they were installed. So nobody did a quality check whether how many bolts was to be installed, and they forgot to install 4 bolts. And this was because the QC procedure was sublet to an outside agency. So these are some of the issues which I find are a result of not focus on the quality control and training and real experience, knowledge, which is Boeing was really proud of its staff, and just like the other companies like GE come to my mind, and GE was a very traditional company and they had a 6 Sigma concept. So the 6 levels of quality control and verification process, which companies wanted to adopt and make sure that this product, whatever they build is built to last as desired. So these are some of my initial remarks on this. As an engineer, I can see that this, there are some lapses, in the, and because the companies are being, owned by the investors now, so they dominate the criteria where the savings should be made, and who should lead the company, and the share price is very important. And I remember the Boeing was a $400 stock, now it's down to maybe half the price, and people have lost money because they really believed in Boeing, and I think they didn't realize what's going on in the last 10 years, and it's a shame, for the general public, and confidence in our companies, the corporate culture has changed, and my personal experience I want to share is when I joined Ibasco in the 60s, we were, because of the business climate and whatever slowing down, we were sold 5 times, from Raytheon to Washington Group to URS, and now we are AECOM. So the companies focus on mainly, profit. So they're not looking at when Raytheon took over Ibasco, and anybody who was less than 70% productive on a monthly basis would be fired. So normally as an engineer, sometimes you have slack periods, but that was the policy of Raytheon. He said you cannot work if you don't have enough. So many senior people left. So certainly, in that situation, there is a vacuum. So you don't train the people who take over. They're not enough skill or experience. So that can happen in a company, when there's large turnovers. I hope, we can get some lesson, from these disasters and focus on the real, issues, and and the focus should be on the employees. They are the really strength of the company, and that somehow has to be reintroduced. So.
Thank you very much. I think that's right. Lyndon LaRouche used to talk very much about the Mittelstand, which sounds like a Basco was. It's not a huge firm, and the people talk to each other. And he would say, and you have the suggestion box, or
Yes.
people working, they say, oh, don't you think it would be better? We could do it this way. And of course, that's the value of having your point of production be near your executive headquarters, like having the Boeing offices be in Seattle and not far away in Chicago. A couple things come to mind. One is I've been involved in a battle in Manhattan to stop the closure of Beth Israel, which is pretty much happening now. What happened was Beth Israel, which was built in, I believe, 1890 in Lower Manhattan, a 800-bed hospital, got taken over by Mount Sinai in 2013. The vice chair or co-chair of the board of trustees at Mount Sinai happens to also be the co-chair of a committee at Goldman Sachs for real estate. He's not a doctor. He doesn't care about healthcare or anything. So the first thing they did was asset strip. They just started shutting down everything at Beth Israel that generated any revenue. And then they said, oh, the hospital's bankrupt. It's losing $160 million a year. Now, Mount Sinai has a gross income of over $24 billion a year. So this is not fatal, but 160 million. Oh, we're going to have to shut it down altogether. That was the last hospital for people below 16th Street in Manhattan. St. Vincent's had closed earlier, which was a leading research facility, did a really phenomenal work treating AIDS during the AIDS pandemic. And that was closed. And now you have this one being closed, and there's no plan to make it up. The other thing is, I'm sure people remember Boeing, there were these sort of alarming cases of a handful of whistleblowers who were going to court, one of whom died. I was just looking up their names to remember, because I think we should remember people. Josh Dean, who got a sudden infection and was dead 2 weeks later. And then he was a quality auditor for Boeing and I guess Spirit Airlines. And then another person, John Barnett, who I believe was an engineer, who was actually in court about to testify and suddenly committed suicide in his car. And we have the mentality of Enron. If people read, that's before some people's time, of our younger listeners, where literally these shareholders actually take a sadistic pleasure in making other people suffer while they make money. And that is the mentality of this whole, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. What kind of person wants to produce weapons that are going to kill and maim innocent children? Who takes pleasure in this, or who is so amoral that they really don't care as long as they get rich? And I think this is a really serious change. I'm hoping the plight of these astronauts can help change it. And Bill, I wanted to ask you if aren't there health hazards? I mean, there's obviously, it seems to me, psychological issues. If you're up there in space, there's only two of you, and you thought you were going home in 8 days, and suddenly you've been there for 2 months. I can't imagine that these two astronauts, I mean, I love my husband very much, but if I were stuck in a space station with him for 2 months, um, you know, where do you go when you need a timeout? So, and then radiation and lack of gravity, all these things, aren't there health? I mean, it just seems we're not acting like there's any urgency to this.
Right. No. Yeah. Obviously, there are. I mean, look, they're being supplied. The Progress Russian ships are bringing up supplies all the time, and I'm sure they're not going to run out of food or anything. But being in that environment at their age as well, I mean, they're no spring chicken. That could have a deleterious effect on them, maybe not immediately, but in the long term. And there's been a lot of studies about that, the long term presence in space in microgravity. But it's not that you immediately would have a fear of doing that. But since they weren't there, since they weren't examined either beforehand, with regard to a long-term flight, and 6 months is a relatively long term in space, there could very well be health hazards to them. And I think, I mean, the pictures that they show, they're all look like they're having fun and the like. But I think they're living in very tight quarters to begin with. Weren't intended to be so many up there at one time. And it is a psychological pressure, especially when they don't know when they're going back. They have no map for what's going to happen over the next few months, and that adds to the pressure, of course. The uncertainty. But yes, the health hazards could be very serious. Maybe not immediately, but maybe within a year, and so because of the effects of microgravity over the long term.
Nash, has it been your experience? I'm sure you've seen in the years that you've worked as an engineer cases, maybe not at your company, but others, or heard of them, where there was a similar lack of regard for the safety of people. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I know, because see, I mean, when we're building the nuclear projects, there was a state agency, federal agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So that was a completely independent government agency which would come to our office and talk to us and make sure that this was a completely government agency, would check our design and verify, and they would also visit the field. So there was like another third party, from the government, who would be overseeing everything, that everything is built according to the requirements of the design, so because it was a nuclear industry. I think something similar can be done. I mean, I guess we have organizations like FAA is there, and the NTSB, but this is like during construction, during design, maybe, I think they come in the picture when something happens, after the fact, which I think during the design, if there can be some additional supervision of the thing and verification that the design is met. And I think again it comes down to the budget, funding. Somebody has to make available enough funds so you can do a satisfactory job also. So it's I mean, there's always, government has to have funds also. I think when if the government don't have money, they will not be able to do these things. I know. I mean, the accidents happen, and I guess as a follow-up, I mean, unfortunately, we have only one airline in the United States. There's no competition. So if there's competition, that will encourage also, and the trend to merge. Like I know the Spirit Airlines is also part of Boeing. I mean, sometimes you wonder, I mean, how things work. I mean, so I guess there's more to be done. The main thing is coming down to, I mean, which is more important, safety, but the culture has to change. Focus. Some of that focus is missing, I think, in the present day industry. I think it's try to just finish the job. I'm working on a New York terminal, JFK, and I see that happening too. The emphasis is to just build, and if something is not right, they say, well, justify it somehow, make someone, accept it as a non-conformist or something. And I think normally, if I were doing the job, I will not allow it to happen. So if the quality check should be there, if things are not right, you have to stop the job. But nobody wants to stop the job, and that's what is happening. It costs money to stop. So these are the changes in the culture, I think, in a construction industry.
Bill, what thoughts do you have on that?
Let me say something about. I want to say something about this space cooperation issue. I mean, on the one hand, it's a question of the paradigm that if we go out to space with the same paradigm we have here, what are we going to have? The War of the Worlds or something like that. But more seriously, is this situation that now we're dealing with a critical situation on the moon, which is relatively close, and we're, because of political reasons, we're having problems of cooperating. But if cooperation is not a paradigm as we move further out, I think of the movie, one of my favorite movies that I watch every time it's on television, The Martian, of Matt Damon, who is lost on Mars, and what happens? We got the Chinese space vehicle that gives a helping hand there. Now, if there's no interoperability, if there's no international cooperation, when you're dealing with a problem, and you will have problems in places like Mars or places further beyond that, then it's like a boat out on a big ocean, that if the boat capsizes or is in danger, what you do is you try and contact whatever boat is close by to come and help. But that requires that you have a network of cooperation which is effective. And if you don't have that, these things can be much more serious problems. And I think people have to think about that, because the moon is not the end. I mean, there's more to come. And therefore, we have to have a paradigm already now of mankind going out to space. How is it going to have to operate? How a country is going to have to operate or cooperate either together in flights, or at least in tandem with each other, is going to be very important.
Very good.
Also, I mean, there's just I think working in classical music in particular is really important for this culture. And I don't mean because music is culture, but if you're striving to recreate, shall I say, a composition by a genius, by Mozart or Bach, you demand a certain quality of perfection. And it's the same in poetry, or, I mean, we now have ugly so-called modern art and modern music, which doesn't have these standards, but you strive for perfection. You have an idea in your mind, which you can never perfectly attain, but you're working on it. And I was thinking about Gene Kranz and this idea of failure is not an option. And after the Apollo, it was one, wasn't it, where the astronauts burned on the launch pad, and this was so horrible. And he basically said, no, never, we will never allow this to happen again. It is never going to happen again. Human life is too precious. And then when you got to Apollo 13 with the failures and the question of how do we get people back, and he deployed the whole team and he said, they are not dying in space. We are bringing them back safely, and we're going to figure this out. And I think that kind of determination, where you say this must be done, frankly, it's part perhaps of a culture also of optimism, because you say there's a future after me. One person wrote in the comments, they said, well, why would young people want to ever become astronauts if we say, well, you get stuck up there in space and, oh, well, we don't want to spend the money to bring you back. I mean, it's amazing. We found $80 billion to bail out AIG, which I don't even know what they do. But it's not something that human life depends on. But a couple, and the standard to be an astronaut, I'm sure these are amazing people. Most of our astronauts are physicists and engineers and doctors, and I mean, they're fluent in multiple languages. They're just amazing, valuable citizens. And if we could be so cavalier about leaving them there, and we don't have to solve this, I just find that very bizarre, frankly.
It's also the fact that you really have to, and this has to happen at the top level, which is not going to happen anytime soon, as far as we can see, that there has to be a vision of what we're doing in space, and that vision, unfortunately, is not there today. We see some similarities of what's going on, for instance, in a place like China, where space is relatively new to people, but they really have an idea of what they want to do with this. They're going that they will have a space station on the moon by around 2030. I don't think there's any doubt in that, because everything that they're doing on a daily basis is oriented towards resolving these problems. And we kind of lost that. And we lost it with the commercialization and the fact that we didn't do much in space after we got to the International Space Station. We were kind of going around in, orbit the whole time. That's not as exciting as trying to go to Mars or something like that. So that people didn't get excited about it. And that's the vision that has to be implemented. And unfortunately, our vision is more this, creating this Artemis exclusive club between countries so that we can counter what Russia and China are doing in space. And I don't think that's going to excite people, not exactly in the right way, because that's what attracts the people you talk about, the challenge. And the challenge really has to be there, because that's really the whoop and wharf of life, is meeting these challenges and as a human being. And if the country isn't giving that, then you have a deterioration in the culture, which we, of course, have seen in this country now for some time. I would just like to mention to Nash the role of, which I think is one of the most remarkable people in the nuclear field, that's Admiral Hyman Rickover. And I always going by nowadays, knowing something about him. And I used to do tours in Arlington Cemetery, and I would often go by Rickover's grave. He's up there right close to Kennedy. The admirals are just on the opposite side of where the Kennedy grave site is. And Rickover is there. But in terms of the rigor, the intellectual rigor of creating something new, and he did develop the first American nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
He actually built the first civilian power plant because he knew how to do it from the submarine. But it was that rigor that was absolutely essential in choosing the people he was with, in having that quality control, right? And I mean, even after this 3 Mile Island, which I think was a result largely of the lack of that kind of quality control, he sent his people up there to figure out what had gone wrong, because obviously they weren't following his lead on that. He wasn't responsible for that plant, but he was the one. I mean, he was really kind of a paradigm of someone of that nature, an engineer who was totally committed to having an effective product, and in this case, a safe product.
That's well said. Yeah, it's true.
Well, perhaps we should wrap up. So let me ask each of you if you have any parting thoughts for our listeners. Nash, maybe you go first.
Well, I'm hopeful, when chips are down, we start thinking, and maybe solutions do come. Man, we are very creative, and then we learn from our mistakes. So hopefully we realize, it's not that bad yet, but hopefully we can wake up, and main thing is to find funding for these projects. We should be willing to, the taxation, whatever, has to be done to run these projects, through extra money. And I guess the billionaires have to put in their share, So because many years ago, we didn't have too many billionaires and the country was being run. Now we have more billionaires, and they're taking away the wealth and, spending on projects which are not really helping us on a day-to-day basis, and infrastructure, for example. And I think that's where, some people are, active and helping, voluntary basis, but we need more of that to be present, to revive, as I said, the optimism and should be there, and the vigor should be there in our daily life. And I think that is missing. And COVID did not help, unfortunately, in the last 5 years.
Right.
And people have I mean, there's very little human contact, and that also is not going to help. There'll be more mistakes, during this process, because really there's very little check and balance, going on right now. So hopefully we can get over it,
Yes, well, thank you, and I appreciate your optimism. Bill?
Yeah, I would just say that I think people should really use this issue, if possible, on the Soyuz alternative in a way to kind of open up a larger debate in this country, not only about the problems within our own space program, but also the need for this cooperation between the United States and Russia. I mean, we should also be appealing to people to get a call to Putin to do something on this. Remember 9/11, the first person who came over here, to give assistance was Vladimir Putin, who met with Bush up there in Kennebunkport. And I remember that. I was up there. I remember that very clearly. And I think they would help on this. And somehow we've got just this narrative which is so intense and so false that by pointing out this issue, somehow you might be able to break through some of the controlled environment to talk about reality, because it's the lives of our astronauts and that are at stake here. And so more pensioners should get out and give their own call for having Soyuz go up there.
Right, I agree. Well, since Kamala Harris as vice president is officially the top of the line, I think we should bombard her. This is a test. Are you qualified to be president? Well, what are you going to do about these two astronauts? Will you allow Russia to step in and assist? And perhaps then change your attitude about the necessity of destroying this other country, which is a really bizarre thing. I mean, why is it supposed to be inspiring that our mission is to destroy somebody else? I don't think so. I think that's part of the problem, as opposed to thinking about what we might do together for the good of mankind. So I want to thank both of you. We are clearly in big history. The world is not going to continue as it's been going. Things are either going to get very bad or very much better. And that really depends on the action of each of us in this coming period. So I'd like to thank you both very much. And I'd like to remind all of my supporters who are listening, we are now fewer than 75 days or so until the election. And I need your help. I need funds. I need volunteers. I need people to go out and put up signs and carry banners and to call into radios and do everything. So please sign up at my website, sareforsenate.com. Thank you both. And also my usual disclaimer, participation in the SARE for Senate Symposium does not necessarily constitute endorsement of my campaign or any campaign or indicate agreement with everything I have said, just as I may or may not agree with everything that my guests have said, although in this case, I agree with my guests. So
I
thank
think
you.
your guests agree with you too.
We agree with you. That's
Oh,
true.
very good. Very good. So thank you so
On the
much.
same page.
Okay, take care.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.